My son Daniel stood in my living room, his expensive suit wrinkled from the flight, and delivered the words that would change everything between us forever. Mom, let's be honest here. You're getting too senile to handle money anymore. It's time we took control before you lose everything. The crystal vase on my mantelpiece seemed to tremble as his wife Jennifer nodded approvingly, her designer handbag clutched tightly, as if afraid I might somehow contaminate it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't realize was that within 48 hours, I would prove exactly how capable my supposedly senile mind was by orchestrating the largest charitable donation in our county's history. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and for 72 years, I believed that family meant unconditional love, mutual respect, and supporting each other through life's challenges. I had built my life around that belief, especially after my husband Robert passed away 8 years ago, leaving me to navigate widowhood while maintaining the successful antique restoration business we had built together over 3 decades. The living room where everything unraveled had always been my sanctuary. Every piece told a story of careful curation and patient restoration. The Victorian settee had been rescued from an estate sale in Pennsylvania, its horsehair stuffing painstakingly replaced and its mahogany frame lovingly refinished. The Persian rug beneath our feet had been a gift from a grateful client whose family heirloom I had saved from water damage. The crystal chandelier overhead had been Robert's surprise for our 25th wedding anniversary, each prism catching the afternoon light and casting rainbows across the oak-paneled walls. This room had witnessed decades of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet evenings where Robert and I would sit by the fireplace, planning our next restoration project or discussing Daniel's latest achievements. After Robert's death, it had become my refuge, surrounded by beautiful objects that reminded me of our shared passion and the life we had built together through hard work and dedication. That particular autumn afternoon started, like so many others since Daniel had moved to California with Jennifer 5 years earlier. I had spent the morning in my workshop carefully stripping layers of paint from an 18th-century secretary desk when I received the call that they were flying in for an unexpected visit. My heart had leaped with joy at the prospect of seeing my only child, though a small part of me wondered why they hadn't given more notice. I immediately set aside my work and began preparing the house for their arrival. Fresh flowers from my garden filled the main rooms, their autumn colors reflecting the changing season outside. I prepared Daniel's favorite meal, the same beef stroganoff I had made for his birthday every year since he was 7 years old. The dining room table was set with my finest china, the spode pattern that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, each piece carefully maintained despite being over a century old. Daniel arrived looking every inch the successful tech executive he had become, his charcoal gray suit tailored perfectly, his dark hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive salons. At 42, he had inherited Robert's height and my green eyes, though they seemed harder now than I remembered, lacking the warmth that had characterized him as a child. Success in Silicon Valley had changed him, sharpened edges that used to be soft, replaced spontaneous laughter with calculated responses. Jennifer glided beside him like a fashion magazine come to life, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her cream-colored dress probably costing more than most people spent on clothing in a year. She had never warmed to me, viewing our relationship as an obligation rather than an opportunity. Her background in corporate law had given her a way of speaking that made everything sound like a negotiation, every conversation a potential hostile takeover. The house looks exactly the same, Daniel observed, setting down his leather briefcase with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was already thinking about business rather than enjoying a family reunion. You haven't changed anything since Dad died. Why would I change what works perfectly well? I replied, embracing him with the enthusiasm I always felt when he visited, though his response was mechanical, distant. I've added a few new pieces to the collection, but the basics remain the same. Jennifer surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property values, rather than appreciating family history. It's very traditional, she said in a tone that made the words sound like a criticism. Very old-fashioned. We settled into the living room with coffee served in my best porcelain cups. the ones Robert and I had bought during our honeymoon trip to England. I had hoped for a pleasant afternoon catching up on their lives, hearing about Daniel's latest projects, perhaps even discussing the possibility of grandchildren we had talked about years earlier but never seemed to materialize. Instead, the conversation quickly took on an uncomfortable formality. Daniel asked perfunctory questions about my health, my business, my daily routine, but his attention seemed elsewhere, his responses automatic rather than engaged. Jennifer checked her phone repeatedly, occasionally making comments about flight delays or hotel reservations that suggested this visit was more duty than desire. "How's the restoration business these days?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he was asking out of obligation rather than genuine interest. "Busier than ever, actually," I replied, settling into my favorite armchair. People are finally understanding the value of preserving quality craftsmanship rather than replacing everything with modern reproductions. I just finished a dining set for a client in Virginia, 18 pieces that had been damaged in a house fire. It took 3 months, but the results were spectacular. Jennifer looked up from her phone with what might have been interest. "That sounds expensive." It was a significant project, I agreed, but worth every hour invested. There's something deeply satisfying about bringing beautiful things back to life, preserving history for future generations. Daniel shifted in his chair, and I caught something in his expression that made me uneasy. "Mom, that's actually something we wanted to talk to you about. Your business, your finances, your future." The word future hung in the air with ominous weight. I set down my coffee cup, suddenly alert to undercurrents I hadn't noticed before. "What about my future?" Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her expression taking on the kind of professional sympathy I associated with lawyers delivering bad news. "Eleanor, we've been concerned about you living alone out here, managing such a complex business at your age. It's a lot of responsibility for someone in their 70s. I'm 72, and I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs," I replied, though something cold was beginning to settle in my chest. "My business is thriving, my health is excellent, and I have no intention of slowing down anytime soon." Daniel exchanged a look with Jennifer that I couldn't quite interpret, but it felt like a signal, a predetermined cue in a conversation I was beginning to realize had been planned long before they arrived. "That's just it, Mom. We're not sure your judgment is as sharp as it used to be." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My judgment? What are you talking about?" "Small things," Jennifer said in the tone one might use to discuss symptoms with a doctor. "When we talk on the phone, you sometimes repeat yourself. You mentioned forgetting where you put your keys last month. And some of the financial decisions you've been making lately seem questionable." I stared at them both, trying to process what I was hearing. I mentioned misplacing my keys once because I was distracted by a difficult repair project. As for repeating myself,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
perhaps that's because you never seem to be listening the first time I say something. Daniel leaned forward, his expression taking on what I recognized as his courtroom manner, the persuasive tone he used when closing important deals. "Mom, we're not trying to hurt your feelings. We're trying to help. You're getting older, and with age comes certain cognitive changes. It's perfectly natural." "Cognitive changes?" I repeated, the phrase tasting bitter in my mouth. "Are you suggesting I'm developing dementia?" "We're suggesting that maybe it's time to consider simplifying your life," Jennifer interjected smoothly. "Letting other people handle the complicated financial aspects while you focus on enjoying your retirement." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around me. These were my son and daughter-in-law, people who were supposed to love and support me, discussing my mental capacity as if I were a child who needed supervision. "I'm not retired, and I don't need anyone to handle my financial affairs." Daniel's voice took on a harder edge. "Mom, let's be realistic here. You're living alone in this big house, running a business that requires complex scheduling and financial management, handling investments and property maintenance. What happens if you make a mistake? What happens if you forget something important? What happens if you fall and can't get help?" Jennifer added. "What happens if someone takes advantage of your isolation?" Their words felt like an ambush, each concern delivered with the precision of a well-rehearsed presentation. I began to understand that this wasn't a spontaneous conversation born of genuine worry, but a calculated intervention designed to achieve a specific outcome. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Daniel straightened his tie, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was about to ask for something he knew I wouldn't want to give. "We think you should consider moving closer to us in California. There are some beautiful senior communities there, places where you wouldn't have to worry about property maintenance or business management." "Senior communities?" The phrase came out as barely a whisper. "You want me to move into a retirement home?" "Not a home," Jennifer corrected quickly. "A community. Independent living with support services available when you need them. You'd have your own apartment, but with the security of knowing help is nearby." I looked around my living room, taking in the furniture Robert and I had collected over decades of marriage. The restoration projects that represented thousands of hours of careful work, the books and photographs and mementos that told the story of our life together. They were suggesting I abandon everything I had built, everything that connected me to Robert's memory, everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. "And my business?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Daniel's expression became carefully neutral. "It might be time to consider selling. The market for restoration services is changing anyway, and at your age, it makes sense to liquidate your assets and focus on enjoying the money you've accumulated." The casual way he dismissed decades of passionate work, the life's calling that had brought Robert and me together and sustained me through grief, was breathtaking in its cruelty. But it was Jennifer's next words that revealed the true nature of their concern. "The important thing is making sure your assets are properly managed before any cognitive decline becomes more pronounced," she said with professional detachment. "We've spoken to a financial planner in California who specializes in elder care planning. He can help transition your accounts and investments to a structure that provides better oversight." The pieces of their puzzle suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about my well-being or my safety. This was about gaining control of my money while they could still justify it as being in my best interest. They had flown across the country not to visit their beloved mother and grandmother, but to execute a plan they had obviously been developing for some time. "You want to take control of my finances," I said quietly, the reality of their intentions finally becoming clear. Daniel had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he didn't deny it. "We want to make sure you're protected, Mom. That someone is looking out for your interests." "My interests?" I repeated slowly. "And who exactly would be looking out for my interests in this arrangement?" Jennifer's mask slipped slightly, revealing the calculating lawyer beneath the concerned daughter-in-law facade. "Daniel would have power of attorney, naturally. As your only child, he's the logical choice to manage your estate." "My estate?" The words tasted like ashes. "You're talking about managing my estate while I'm still alive and perfectly capable of managing it myself." The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, its familiar rhythm now sounding like a countdown to something terrible. Daniel stared at his hands, apparently unable to meet my eyes. Jennifer maintained her professional composure, but I could see the impatience flickering beneath her sympathetic expression. Finally, Daniel looked up, and what I saw in his face broke something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. There was no love there, no genuine concern for my welfare. Instead, I saw the cold calculation of someone who viewed me as an obstacle to overcome, a problem to be solved. "Mom, let's be honest here," he said, his voice taking on the kind of firm finality that brooked no argument. "You're getting too senile to handle money anymore. It's time we took control before you lose everything." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into wounds I hadn't known existed. Senile. The clinical term for the deterioration of mental faculties, the gradual erosion of everything that made a person who they were. My own son, the child I had raised with infinite love and patience, the boy I had supported through every challenge and celebrated through every triumph, was declaring me mentally incompetent. Jennifer nodded approvingly, as if Daniel had finally said what she had been waiting to hear. "It's really the kindest thing to do, Eleanor. This way you won't have to worry about making difficult decisions or managing complex financial matters. You can just relax and enjoy your golden years." I sat there in my beautiful living room, surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime of hard work and careful planning, being told by my own family that I was too mentally diminished to be trusted with the results of my own success. The irony was not lost on me that they were using my supposed cognitive decline to justify taking control of assets I had accumulated through decades of sharp business acumen and careful financial planning. "Get out," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos raging in my chest. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Mom?" "Get out of my house," I repeated, rising from my chair with all the dignity I could muster. "Both of you, now." Jennifer's professional facade cracked completely. "Eleanor, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you." "You're trying to steal from me," I corrected, walking toward the front door with purposeful strides. "You've decided I'm mentally incompetent, based on the fact that I occasionally misplace my keys and sometimes repeat myself during phone conversations where you're clearly not paying attention. That's not medical evidence of cognitive decline. That's normal human behavior." Daniel stood quickly, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "Mom, you're proving my point right now. You're being paranoid and irrational." I turned to face him at the door, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time in years the man my son had become. Successful, wealthy, and utterly without regard for anyone whose usefulness to him had expired. "I'm being protective of assets I earned through my own intelligence and hard work. If that seems paranoid to you, perhaps the problem isn't with my mental state." They gathered their things, with the stiff movements of people who were accustomed to getting their way and couldn't quite process being denied. Jennifer's goodbye was icily polite. Daniel's was uncomfortable and vaguely threatening, filled with references to having difficult conversations later when I was feeling more reasonable. I watched their rental car disappear down my tree-lined driveway and stood in my doorway for a long time afterward, feeling the full weight of what had just occurred. My son thought I was senile. My daughter-in-law saw me as an aging obstacle to wealth they considered rightfully theirs. The family I had devoted my life to building and maintaining viewed me as nothing more than a deteriorating asset in need of management. But as I walked back through my house, taking in the beautiful objects Robert and I had collected and restored over decades of marriage, running my fingers over the smooth wood surfaces we had brought back to life through patient craftsmanship, I felt something unexpected stirring beneath the hurt and betrayal. If Daniel thought I was too senile to handle money, perhaps it was time to show him exactly how capable my supposedly deteriorating mind could be. I had built a successful business from nothing, accumulated substantial wealth through careful planning and smart investments, and maintained complex financial portfolios that had grown consistently for decades. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and I was about to prove it in a way that would leave no doubt about my mental faculties. I walked to my study, a small room lined with file cabinets containing decades of business records, investment statements, and legal documents. Robert and I had always been meticulous record keepers, maintaining detailed files on every aspect of our financial lives. After his death, I had continued the practice, carefully tracking every investment, every business transaction, every penny that flowed in and out of our various accounts. The safe behind Robert's desk contained our most important documents, including detailed financial statements that would have shocked Daniel if he had bothered to ask about my actual net worth rather than simply assuming I needed his management. Over the years, the restoration business had generated substantial profits, but more importantly, Robert and I had been shrewd investors, purchasing properties in developing areas long before they became desirable, investing in companies whose potential we recognized before they became household names. The numbers on the statements were impressive even to me sometimes. $6 million in various accounts and investments, accumulated through decades of hard work, careful planning, and smart financial decisions. Property holdings worth another $2 million, including the workshop complex where I ran my restoration business, and several rental properties that generated steady monthly income. If Daniel thought I was too senile to manage $8 million worth of assets, I would show him just how competently I could manage them. But not in the way he expected. I spent the evening going through every financial document, every investment statement, every property deed. By the time I went to bed, I had a complete picture of my net worth, and a clear idea of what I wanted to do with it. The plan that was forming in my mind would accomplish two things. It would demonstrate beyond any doubt that my mental faculties were perfectly intact, and it would ensure that my money went to people who would truly benefit from it, rather than to a son who viewed me as mentally incompetent. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn air carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of change. I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit, the one I wore for important business meetings, and drove to the office of my attorney, Margaret Whitfield, a sharp woman in her 50s who had handled my legal affairs since Robert's death. Margaret's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian mansion in the historic district, its high ceilings and original hardwood floors speaking to the same appreciation for quality craftsmanship that had guided my own career. Margaret herself was the kind of lawyer I respected: thorough, ethical, and utterly devoted to her clients' best interests rather than her own profit margins. "Eleanor," she greeted me with genuine warmth, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged around her antique desk. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" I settled into the familiar chair and accepted the offer of coffee, taking a moment to organize my thoughts. Margaret had known me for 8 years, had seen me navigate the complex legal and financial issues surrounding Robert's death, had worked with me on business contracts and property acquisitions. She knew better than most people that my mind was sharp and my judgment sound. "I need to make some changes to my estate planning," I said without preamble. "Significant changes." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression attentive but neutral. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" I had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but actually speaking, the words still felt momentous. "I want to leave everything to charity. All of it. The business, the properties, the investments, everything." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't seem shocked. After decades of practicing law, she had probably seen every variety of family drama and its consequences. "That's a substantial change from your current will. May I ask what's prompted this decision?" I told her about Daniel and Jennifer's visit, their accusations of mental incompetence, their plan to take control of my finances. As I spoke, I could see Margaret's expression growing more serious, her lawyer's mind no doubt recognizing the implications of what I was describing. "They actually used the word senile," she asked when I finished. "Multiple times. They seem convinced that I'm experiencing cognitive decline and need their management of my affairs." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the careful attention of someone assessing a client's mental state. "Eleanor, you know I have to ask this. Are you making this decision out of anger? Estate planning done in emotional extremes sometimes leads to regret later." "I'm not acting out of anger," I replied honestly. "I'm acting out of clarity. For the first time in years, I see my son exactly as he is rather than as I wanted him to be. He doesn't love me as a person. He loves me as a source of future inheritance. Since he's convinced I'm too mentally diminished to manage money properly, I'm going to prove him wrong by making the most carefully considered charitable donation in this county's history." Margaret made notes on her legal pad, occasionally asking questions about my wishes and preferences. We discussed various charitable organizations, the tax implications of such a large donation, the legal structures that would ensure the money was used effectively. With each detail we worked out, I felt more confident that this was the right decision. "This is quite an undertaking," Margaret said finally. "We're talking about establishing multiple charitable funds, creating oversight structures, ensuring long-term sustainability. It will require careful planning and expert management." "Which is exactly my point," I replied. "If I were truly experiencing cognitive decline, would I be capable of orchestrating something this complex?" Margaret smiled for the first time since our conversation began. "Indeed. This level of planning and foresight suggests mental faculties that are functioning at a very high level. When would you like to begin the process?" "Immediately. And Margaret, I want this done with absolute legal precision. No room for challenge, no possibility of contest." I want it ironclad. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details. The restoration business would be sold, with the proceeds establishing the Robert Mitchell Foundation for Historic Preservation, funding grants for craftspeople and institutions dedicated to preserving cultural artifacts. The rental properties would be liquidated to create the Eleanor Mitchell Education Fund, providing scholarships for students from low-income families pursuing degrees in art, history, or museum studies. The investment accounts would be divided among several existing charities. Medical research focused on diseases affecting women, support services for widows and widowers, programs providing mental health services for seniors. Each donation would be substantial enough to make a real difference, while demonstrating the kind of careful financial planning that required sharp analytical skills and clear judgment. "I want one more thing," I said as we were finishing up the initial planning. "I want a detailed psychiatric evaluation included in the file, demonstrating my mental competence at the time these decisions were made." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Excellent idea. Dr. Sarah Chen is one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state. I'll arrange for a comprehensive evaluation that will document your mental state thoroughly." The psychiatric evaluation took place 3 days later in Dr. Chen's comfortable office. For 2 hours, she put me through a battery of tests designed to assess memory, reasoning ability, judgment, and overall cognitive function. She asked me to remember lists of words, solve mathematical problems, interpret complex scenarios, and explain my reasoning for various decisions. When we finished, Dr. Chen reviewed her notes with the kind of professional thoroughness I associated with the best craftspeople in my own field. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be very clear about my findings. Your cognitive function tests at the 95th percentile for your age group. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning ability is sharp, and your judgment appears sound. There is absolutely no evidence of dementia, cognitive decline, or any condition that would impair your ability to make complex financial decisions. And you'll put that in writing? I'll provide a comprehensive written evaluation that documents your mental competence in detail. Anyone who suggests you're experiencing cognitive decline is either misinformed or operating from motives that have nothing to do with your actual mental state." The report, when it arrived a week later, was everything I had hoped for and more. 12 pages of detailed analysis concluding that my mental faculties were not only intact but functioning at a level well above average for people my age. It would become a crucial part of the legal file Margaret was assembling, evidence that the charitable donations I was making represented careful, competent decision-making, rather than the confused actions of someone experiencing mental decline. Over the following weeks, the plan took shape with the kind of precision that had characterized every major project Robert and I had undertaken together. The business was appraised and put on the market, attracting immediate interest from other restoration specialists who recognized its value and reputation. The rental properties were evaluated and prepared for sale. Investment accounts were reviewed and reorganized to facilitate the eventual transfers. Each step of the process required careful coordination between multiple professionals: attorneys, accountants, financial advisors, and charitable organization administrators. The complexity of the undertaking was substantial, requiring exactly the kind of sharp analytical thinking and careful project management that someone experiencing cognitive decline would find impossible. Daniel called several times during this period, his messages growing increasingly frustrated as I failed to return his calls. Jennifer sent emails with subject lines like "important family discussion" and "financial planning concerns," all of which I deleted without reading. They had made their position clear, and I was responding with actions rather than arguments. The first major sale closed on a Thursday morning in November. The restoration business, with its established client base and reputation for excellence, sold for significantly more than the appraised value to a consortium of craftspeople who had worked with me for years. The buyer specifically mentioned that they were purchasing not just equipment and client relationships, but a legacy of quality and integrity that had taken decades to build. That afternoon, I called Margaret to begin the first phase of the charitable transfers. $2 million, the proceeds from the business sale, would be immediately donated to establish the Robert Mitchell Foundation for Historic Preservation. The foundation's mission statement, crafted with the same care Robert and I had brought to our finest restoration projects, outlined a comprehensive program for preserving cultural artifacts and supporting traditional crafts. The news of the donation reached the local paper within days. The headline read, "Local Businesswoman Establishes Major Preservation Foundation," accompanied by an article describing the gift as one of the largest single charitable donations in county history. The reporter interviewed several museum directors and preservation specialists, all of whom praised both the generosity of the donation and the thoughtful structure of the foundation. Margaret called that afternoon with amusement evident in her voice. "Eleanor, I thought you'd want to know that my office has received 3 calls today from attorneys asking about your mental competence. Apparently word is getting around that you've made some significant financial moves. Let me guess, one of those calls came from California?" "Indeed. A Mr. Harrison representing Daniel Mitchell. He seemed very interested in discussing your recent activities." I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that my client is of completely sound mind, and that any actions she has taken represent careful, competent decision-making. I also mentioned that we have extensive documentation of her mental state, including professional evaluations, should anyone wish to question her capacity." The second phase of the plan moved forward the following month. The rental properties sold quickly in the strong real estate market, their proceeds going to establish the Eleanor Mitchell Education Fund. The local college agreed to administer the scholarships, with preference given to first-generation college students pursuing degrees in fields related to cultural preservation and education. By December, the local news was calling it the Mitchell Miracle, referring to the unprecedented generosity that was transforming educational and cultural opportunities in our community. Feature articles appeared in regional magazines, praising not only the size of the donations but their thoughtful targeting toward causes that would have lasting impact. Daniel finally appeared at my door on a cold Saturday morning 2 weeks before Christmas. He looked haggard, older than his 42 years, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. The confident tech executive who had visited in October had been replaced by someone who appeared genuinely shaken. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, his voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. "We need to talk." I let him in, not out of forgiveness but out of curiosity about what he might say. He stood in my living room, the same space where he had declared me mentally incompetent, and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. "I know what you've been doing," he said without preamble. "The donations, the foundation, the scholarships, the lawyers, the news articles, the psychiatric evaluation. And what exactly do you think I've been doing?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with a difficult problem. "You've been proving a point. Proving that your mind is perfectly sharp, that you're completely capable of managing complex financial transactions. Have I succeeded?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the Persian rug beneath his feet. When he looked up, his eyes held something I hadn't seen in years: genuine respect. $6 million, he said quietly. "You've donated $6 million in 3 months, orchestrating transfers that required legal expertise, financial planning, and project management skills that would challenge someone half your age. The psychiatric evaluation shows cognitive function in the 95th percentile. The lawyers say the documentation is flawless." I waited for him to continue, curious about where this conversation was heading. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "You're not senile. Your mind is as sharp as it ever was. Maybe sharper." "Thank you for acknowledging that." "But Mom," he continued, desperation creeping into his voice, "what you've done, giving away everything Dad worked for, everything you built together, it's gone. All of it." I looked at my son, seeing clearly the man he had become, and the values that now guided his life. Success measured in dollars rather than relationships. Security defined by accumulation rather than contribution. Love conditional on financial benefit rather than freely given and received. "Yes," I said simply. "It's all gone to people and causes that will use it to make the world a little better." Exactly as I intended. Daniel sank into the chair he had occupied during his previous visit, his head in his hands. "Do you have any idea what you've thrown away? What you've cost us?" The pronoun wasn't lost on me. Not what I had cost myself, but what I had cost us. Even now, facing the evidence of my mental competence and the finality of my decisions, he was thinking primarily about his own loss rather than my autonomy. "I've thrown away nothing of value," I replied. I've invested in things that matter. The foundation is already funding 3 major preservation projects. The scholarship fund has awarded grants to 12 deserving students. The medical research donations are supporting work that could help thousands of women. That money is doing more good in 3 months than it would have done sitting in investment accounts waiting for your inheritance. But it was supposed to be for family, Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. For our future, for your grandchildren. What grandchildren? I asked gently. You've been married to Jennifer for 6 years, and you've never once mentioned seriously planning for children. And even if you did have children someday, what kind of legacy would I be leaving them? Money gained by declaring their grandmother mentally incompetent? Wealth acquired by convincing someone they loved that she was too senile to manage her own affairs? Daniel was quiet for a long time, perhaps finally understanding the full implications of what he had set in motion with his accusations and demands. The room filled with the kind of heavy silence that follows the recognition of irreversible mistakes. Is there any way to fix this? He asked finally. Any way to restore what we had? I considered his question carefully, looking at this man who had been the center of my world for so many years, who had given my life purpose and meaning after Robert's death. The boy I had loved unconditionally, supported through every challenge, celebrated through every triumph. The son who had grown into someone capable of dismissing me as mentally incompetent for the sake of financial gain. The money is gone, Daniel, I said quietly. The donations are final, the foundations are established, the scholarships are awarded. There's no going back on any of that. I know, but what about us? What about our relationship? I walked to the mantelpiece, looking at one of the few remaining photographs of Daniel as a child, his young face bright with love and trust, as he showed me a painting he had made in school. That boy had believed I could solve any problem, fix any hurt, make everything better with maternal love and patience. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know if there's enough left to rebuild after what's been said and done. You looked at me, your mother who raised you with infinite love and sacrifice, and saw someone too mentally diminished to be trusted with her own money. That's not something I can easily forget. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had spent countless hours planning landscaping projects and discussing the future. I was wrong, not just about your mental state, but about what mattered. Jennifer had me convinced that we needed to protect our financial future, that we couldn't risk you making poor decisions with money we were counting on. Money you were counting on, I repeated. Money I earned and saved and invested through decades of hard work. Money that belonged to me to do with as I saw fit. Yes, he said, turning back to face me. I lost sight of that. I lost sight of a lot of things. We stood there in my living room, surrounded by the beautiful objects that represented a lifetime of shared passion and careful craftsmanship, and I felt the weight of everything that had been broken between us. Trust, respect, unconditional love, all damaged, perhaps irreparably, by his willingness to declare me mentally incompetent for financial gain. Where's Jennifer in all of this? I asked. Daniel's expression darkened. Jennifer is consulting with attorneys about whether there are grounds to challenge your mental competence legally. She believes that anyone who would give away $8 million must be experiencing some form of psychological breakdown. I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Of course she is. And what do you think about that? I think she's about to discover what Dr. Chen already documented, that you're mentally sharper than most people half your age. I think she's going to find that challenging the charitable donations of someone with a 95th percentile cognitive function rating is a losing proposition that will only make us look greedy and vindictive. And how do you feel about looking greedy and vindictive? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, perhaps finally confronting the reality of how their actions appeared to the outside world. A successful son and his lawyer wife attempting to gain control of an elderly mother's finances, then challenging her generosity when their plan backfired. I feel ashamed, he said quietly. I feel like I became someone I don't recognize, someone Dad would be disappointed in. The mention of Robert hit me unexpectedly hard. My husband had adored Daniel, had been so proud of his intelligence and ambition. But Robert had also valued integrity above all else, had built our business on the principle that reputation was more valuable than profit. that treating people with respect and kindness mattered more than accumulating wealth. He would have been heartbroken to see Daniel prioritize money over family relationships. Yes, I said softly. He would have been very disappointed. Daniel nodded, accepting the painful truth. I've made a mess of everything, haven't I? You've certainly created a situation that can't be easily undone, I agreed. The question is what you plan to do now. I want to make things right. I want to find a way back to being the son you deserve. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated manipulation. After decades of reading people in business negotiations, I had developed fairly good instincts about sincerity. What I saw in Daniel's expression suggested real regret, though whether it was regret for hurting me or regret for losing the inheritance remained unclear. Making things right would require acknowledging that your accusations were not only wrong but deeply hurtful, I said. It would require understanding that calling someone senile isn't just an insult, it's an attack on their fundamental dignity and autonomy. I understand that now, Daniel said immediately. I was so focused on what I saw as financial risks that I lost sight of what those words would do to you emotionally. And it would require accepting that the money is gone and never trying to interfere with my charitable activities again. The money is gone, he repeated, as if practicing the words. And you had every right to give it away. We stood in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, both of us grappling with the magnitude of what had been damaged and what might be salvageable. Finally, Daniel spoke again. Can I ask you something? I nodded. When you were planning all of this, the donations and foundations, did you ever consider that Jennifer might have been manipulating me? That maybe I wasn't entirely acting on my own judgment? The question surprised me with its implication that Daniel was beginning to examine his marriage as critically as I was examining our mother-son relationship. Are you saying Jennifer convinced you that I was mentally declining? I'm saying she planted seeds of doubt and then watered them carefully over months of conversations. Little comments about elderly people and their vulnerability to financial scams, stories about her clients whose families had to intervene in their affairs, suggestions that living alone at your age was inherently risky. I processed this information, considering whether it changed anything about Daniel's culpability. Even if Jennifer had influenced his thinking, he was the one who had spoken the cruel words, made the accusations, attempted to seize control of my financial affairs. Does it matter who initiated the idea if you were willing to act on it? I asked. Daniel considered this carefully. I think it matters in terms of understanding how I got so far off track. But you're right that it doesn't excuse what I said or did. I should have recognized that her concerns were motivated by self-interest, rather than genuine worry about your welfare. Self-interest? We had significant debts, Mom. The house in California, Jennifer's shopping habits, the country club membership, private school tuition for Jennifer's niece. We were living well beyond our means, counting on your eventual inheritance to solve our financial problems. This revelation added another layer of betrayal to an already painful situation. Not only had they questioned my mental competence, they had done so while planning to use my money to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford on their own earnings. So when you accused me of being too senile to handle money, you were actually hoping to gain access to that money to solve your own financial problems? Daniel's face flushed with shame. When you put it that way, it sounds even worse than it was. How exactly was it better than that? I convinced myself that we were protecting your interests while also securing our own future. I told myself that professional financial management would be better for you anyway, that you'd be relieved not to have to worry about complex investment decisions. I shook my head in disbelief at the elaborate justifications people could create for self-serving behavior. Daniel, I've been making complex investment decisions successfully for 30 years. My portfolio outperformed the market average consistently throughout that period. What possible evidence did you have that I needed protection from my own financial acumen? None, he admitted quietly. We had no evidence because we never bothered to ask about your actual financial situation. We just assumed that elderly people naturally become less capable of managing money. You assumed, I corrected. based on age-related stereotypes rather than any assessment of my individual capabilities. Yes, and I'm sorry. I'm profoundly sorry for all of it. The apology hung in the air between us, and I found myself unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept it immediately, to restore the relationship that had been such a central part of my identity for so many years. But another part of me recognized that premature forgiveness might simply enable Daniel to repeat similar behavior in the future. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But apologies need to be followed by changed behavior over time before they become meaningful. What would changed behavior look like? I walked back to my chair and sat down, suddenly feeling exhausted by the emotional intensity of the conversation. It would look like treating me as an autonomous adult, capable of making my own decisions. It would look like respecting my choices even when you don't understand or agree with them. It would look like building a relationship based on genuine affection rather than financial expectation. Daniel nodded seriously. I can do that. Can you? Even knowing that there's no inheritance to protect? No financial benefit to maintaining a relationship with me? The question clearly stung, but Daniel didn't flinch away from it. I should want a relationship with you because you're my mother, and I love you, not because of what I might inherit someday. Should want and actually want aren't necessarily the same thing, I observed. You'll need to figure out which one applies to you. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, perhaps finally grappling with the reality of what a relationship with me would look like without the financial component that had apparently motivated much of his recent behavior. I'd like to try, he said eventually. I'd like to find out if I can be a better son than I've been recently. And what about Jennifer? Daniel's expression darkened again. Jennifer is focused on legal strategies for challenging your donations. She's convinced that we can find some grounds for arguing diminished capacity, despite the psychiatric evaluation and all the evidence to the contrary. How do you feel about that? I feel like she's more interested in your money than in your well-being, and it took me far too long to recognize that. I waited for him to elaborate, sensing that he was working through realizations that went beyond our immediate situation. She never liked you, he continued. From the beginning of our relationship, she viewed you as an obligation rather than an opportunity. She complained about having to visit, about having to pretend interest in your business, about the time and energy required to maintain family relationships. And you went along with that attitude? I told myself that not everyone has close family relationships, that Jennifer's more formal approach was just different from what I was used to. But over time, her attitude influenced mine. I started seeing our visits as duties to fulfill rather than opportunities to connect. The admission was painful, but not entirely surprising. I had sensed Jennifer's lack of genuine warmth from early in their relationship, but I had hoped that time and shared experiences would eventually create real bonds between us. Instead, her influence had apparently worked in the opposite direction, cooling Daniel's natural affection and replacing it with calculation. So what happens now? I asked. Do you stand with your wife in her legal challenges, or do you stand with your mother in accepting the consequences of your actions? Daniel stood up and walked to the fireplace, where Robert's photograph sat in its silver frame. He studied the image for a long moment, perhaps remembering the man who had been such a positive influence during his childhood. I stand with what's right, he said finally, which means accepting that you have every right to give your money to whomever you choose, for whatever reasons you choose. Jennifer can pursue her legal challenges if she wants, but she'll do it without my support. That could create significant problems in your marriage. My marriage already has significant problems, Daniel replied. This situation has just made them impossible to ignore. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief at this admission. Sadness because I had never wanted Daniel's marriage to fail, despite my reservations about Jennifer. Relief because his willingness to choose principle over financial partnership suggested that some of his better instincts might still be intact. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. Are you? Really? I considered the question honestly. I'm sorry that you're facing the end of a relationship you invested 6 years in building. I'm sorry that you're dealing with financial stress and marital conflict simultaneously. But I'm not sorry that you're finally seeing Jennifer's true priorities clearly. Daniel nodded slowly. I think I've been seeing a lot of things more clearly lately, including some uncomfortable truths about myself. Such as the fact that I became someone who was willing to declare his own mother mentally incompetent for financial gain. such as the fact that I lost sight of values Dad tried to teach me about integrity and family loyalty, such as the fact that I let someone else's influence override my own better judgment. These admissions suggested a level of self-awareness that gave me hope for the possibility of rebuilding our relationship, though I knew that recognition of problems was only the first step toward solving them. What do you plan to do with those uncomfortable truths? I plan to use them as the foundation for becoming a better person, Daniel said. Starting with being a better son to you. That's a nice sentiment, I replied, but it will require consistent action over time, not just good intentions. I understand that, and I'm prepared to do the work. We talked for another hour, carefully beginning the process of examining what had gone wrong between us and what might be possible going forward. Daniel asked thoughtful questions about the charitable foundations, genuinely seeming to want to understand why I had chosen the specific causes I supported. He expressed admiration for the complexity of the legal and financial planning involved, acknowledging the skill and intelligence required to orchestrate such comprehensive charitable giving. When he finally prepared to leave, the atmosphere between us was cautiously hopeful rather than openly hostile. We hadn't solved anything definitively, but we had established the possibility that solutions might exist. "Can I ask one more favor?" Daniel said as he reached the front door. "What kind of favor?" "Would you be willing to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Just the two of us. No Jennifer. No agenda beyond spending time together." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden motives. What I saw instead was genuine nervousness, as if he was asking for a date, rather than a meal with his mother. "Where were you thinking of going?" "That little Italian place downtown that you mentioned liking. Giuseppe's, I think." The suggestion surprised me, because Giuseppe's was decidedly not the kind of upscale restaurant Daniel usually preferred. It was a small, family-owned establishment, with excellent food but modest decor, the kind of place where conversation mattered more than atmosphere. "You remember me mentioning Giuseppe's?" Daniel looked embarrassed. "I remember you mentioning it several times over the past few years, actually. I always changed the subject because Jennifer didn't like Italian food. I realize now that I should have paid more attention to what you enjoyed rather than what she preferred." This small acknowledgement of past negligence meant more to me than grand gestures would have. It suggested that Daniel was beginning to examine the ways he had prioritized his wife's preferences over mine, even in minor matters that should have been easy accommodations. "Giuseppe's would be lovely," I said. 7 o'clock? Perfect. And Mom? Yes? Thank you for giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it. After Daniel left, I walked through my house feeling emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. The conversation had been painful but necessary, forcing both of us to confront the reality of what had been damaged and what might be repairable. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and accept responsibility for his actions was encouraging, though I knew that real change would require sustained effort over time rather than a single afternoon of honest conversation. The next evening, I arrived at Giuseppe's to find Daniel already waiting at a small table near the window, studying the menu with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for legal documents. He stood when he saw me approaching, a gesture of courtesy that reminded me of Robert's old-fashioned manners. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, and for the first time in years the compliment sounded genuine rather than obligatory. I had chosen my outfit carefully, wanting to look well put together without appearing to be trying too hard. The simple black dress was elegant but not formal, paired with the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. Daniel's appreciation seemed authentic, suggesting that he was making an effort to really see me rather than simply going through the motions of filial duty. The restaurant was exactly as I remembered it, warm, unpretentious, with the kind of comfortable atmosphere that encouraged lingering conversations. The owner, Giuseppe himself, greeted me with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized a regular customer, asking about recent restoration projects and complimenting me on the news coverage of my charitable donations. "You are famous now, Mrs. Mitchell," he said with his charming Italian accent. "The whole neighborhood is talking about your generosity." Daniel listened to this interaction with interest, perhaps seeing me through the eyes of someone who knew me as a successful businesswoman and valued community member, rather than simply as his aging mother. We ordered wine and began the cautious process of relearning how to talk to each other. Daniel asked about current restoration projects, and I found myself describing the intricacies of furniture repair with the enthusiasm I usually reserve for fellow craftspeople. He listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite attention. "I never really understood how complex your work was," he admitted over the antipasto course. "I always thought of it as a nice hobby that happened to generate some income." "It was never a hobby," I replied. "It was a profession that required years of training, constant learning, and significant business acumen. Robert and I built a reputation based on quality and integrity, and maintaining that reputation required careful attention to every aspect of the business. I see that now. The sale price certainly reflected the value of what you had built." We discussed the foundations I had established, and Daniel showed genuine curiosity about the selection criteria for scholarships and grants. He seemed particularly interested in the Historic Preservation Foundation, asking thoughtful questions about the types of projects it would fund and the long-term impact on cultural heritage. "Dad would have loved the idea of supporting traditional crafts," he observed. "He always said that preserving old techniques was just as important as creating new things." "He did say that," I agreed, touched that Daniel remembered Robert's philosophy about the value of traditional skills. He believed that every generation had a responsibility to pass on knowledge and techniques to the next generation, like he did with me when he taught me woodworking in the garage. I was surprised that Daniel remembered those Saturday morning sessions when Robert had patiently guided him through basic carpentry projects. Daniel had shown some aptitude for working with his hands, but his interests had shifted to more academic pursuits as he grew older. "You were quite good at it, actually," I said. "Robert was always proud of that bookshelf you made in high school." "I still have it in my home office," Daniel said quietly. "It's one of the few things I kept when Jennifer redecorated. She thought it looked too rustic for the aesthetic she was creating." This casual mention of Jennifer's control over their living space revealed another aspect of their relationship that I found troubling. Robert and I had always made decorating decisions together, valuing each other's preferences, and finding ways to incorporate both of our tastes into our shared spaces. "It sounds like Jennifer had very definite ideas about how things should look." "She has definite ideas about most things," Daniel replied with a rueful smile. "Including how I should relate to my family. And how did she think you should relate to me?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, perhaps weighing how much honesty our tentative reconciliation could handle. "She thought family relationships were primarily transactional, that the time and energy spent maintaining them should be proportional to the benefits received." "Benefits like eventual inheritance?" "Among other things, yes." I absorbed this information, understanding more clearly how Jennifer's worldview had gradually influenced Daniel's behavior toward me. If relationships were primarily about mutual benefit rather than mutual affection, then maintaining ties with an aging parent only made sense if there were tangible rewards involved. "And how do you think about family relationships now?" I asked. "I think I lost sight of the fact that some things have value beyond what can be measured financially," Daniel said. "Like having someone in your life who remembers your childhood, who taught you your values, who loves you unconditionally." "Do you believe I love you unconditionally?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. I hope you do, despite everything that's happened." "I do love you unconditionally," I said quietly. "That's what made your accusation so painful. It's one thing to be called senile by strangers or acquaintances. It's quite another to hear it from someone you love more than life itself." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the vulnerable child he had once been. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for the words, for the accusations, for ever making you doubt how much you mean to me." "I never doubted that you meant the words when you said them," I replied. "What I doubted was whether the son I had raised was still there underneath the person you had become." "He is," Daniel said with quiet conviction. "He got lost for a while, but he's still there." We finished dinner in a more comfortable atmosphere than we had shared in years, talking about memories from Daniel's childhood, stories about Robert that we both cherished, plans for the charitable foundations that seemed to genuinely interest Daniel. When the check came, he insisted on paying, a small gesture that felt significant given our recent conflicts over financial matters. "Can I drive you home?" he asked as we prepared to leave. I drove myself, thank you, but I appreciate the offer. "Old habits," he said with a smile. "Dad always insisted on seeing you safely home, even when you were perfectly capable of getting there yourself. He was a gentleman. He was. And he set a good example that I should have followed better." We stood outside the restaurant in the cool evening air, both of us seeming reluctant to end the evening, despite having covered all the necessary conversational ground. "Mom," Daniel said finally, "I want you to know that whatever happens with Jennifer, whatever legal challenges she pursues, I won't be part of them. I meant what I said about supporting your right to give your money to whomever you choose. That may create difficulties for you at home. I'm beginning to think those difficulties already existed. This situation has just brought them into the open." I studied his face in the soft light from the restaurant's window, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the person he had been during our previous conflicts. There was a maturity there that hadn't been present before, a willingness to accept difficult truths and uncomfortable consequences. "Thank you for dinner," I said. "And for the conversation. Thank you for agreeing to try again with me." We hugged goodbye, and for the first time in years, the embrace felt genuine, rather than perfunctory. Daniel held on a moment, longer than usual, as if reluctant to let go of this fragile new beginning we had created. Over the following weeks, Daniel made good on his promise to be a better son. He called regularly, not with specific agendas or requests for information, but simply to talk. He asked about my daily activities, shared stories from his work, and gradually began rebuilding the easy communication we had once shared. More importantly, he followed through on his commitment to oppose Jennifer's legal challenges to my charitable donations. When she filed papers questioning my mental competence, Daniel refused to provide supporting testimony. When she hired investigators to examine my recent financial activities, he declined to cooperate with their inquiries. When she demanded that he choose between his mother and his wife, he made his choice clear. The legal challenges themselves proved exactly as futile as Margaret had predicted. Dr. Chen's psychiatric evaluation, combined with the obvious sophistication of the charitable planning I had undertaken, made it impossible to argue that I was experiencing cognitive decline. The investigators found no evidence of coercion or undue influence, no indication that my decisions had been anything other than carefully considered acts of generosity. Jennifer's attorneys eventually advised her to abandon the legal challenges, explaining that continued pursuit would only generate negative publicity and substantial legal fees, with no realistic prospect of success. A woman who had donated millions of dollars to worthy causes while demonstrating exceptional mental acuity was not a sympathetic target for claims of incompetence. The failure of her legal strategy apparently marked the beginning of the end of Daniel and Jennifer's marriage. Without the prospect of recovering my inheritance, their financial problems became insurmountable. Jennifer's expensive lifestyle, funded by credit and assumptions about future wealth, collapsed under the weight of reality. Daniel moved out of their California house in February, returning to our home state to rebuild his life and his relationship with me. He rented a modest apartment in town and began looking for legal work that would allow him to contribute to his community rather than simply accumulating wealth. "I want to do work that Dad would be proud of," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "Something that uses my skills to help people rather than just make money." "What kind of work interests you?" "I've been thinking about family law, actually. Helping people navigate divorce, custody issues, estate planning. Situations where having someone who genuinely cares about the outcome makes a real difference." The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Daniel's interest in family law had been sparked by his own family's legal and emotional challenges. But it seemed like a constructive way to channel his experience into helping others avoid similar mistakes. Daniel eventually found a position with a small firm that specialized in representing middle-class families, dealing with legal transitions. The work paid significantly less than his previous corporate position, but it provided the kind of professional satisfaction that had been missing from his high-powered tech career. "I actually look forward to going to work now," he told me one spring afternoon as we walked through the gardens behind my house. I'm helping a grandmother gain custody of her grandchildren, a widow navigate probate court, a couple plan their estate to protect their disabled child. It feels meaningful. Your father would be proud of that kind of work, I agreed. He always believed that professional success should be measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives. I wish I had understood that earlier, Daniel said. I might have made different choices about career, about marriage, about priorities in general. You understand it now, I pointed out. That's what matters. By summer, Daniel and I had developed a comfortable routine of regular contact that felt natural rather than forced. He helped me with tasks around the house that were becoming more challenging as I aged, but he did so as a loving son rather than someone who questioned my competence. When I decided to downsize from my large house to a smaller place that would be easier to maintain, he supported the decision without suggesting that it indicated cognitive decline. It's a smart move, he said when I showed him the charming cottage I was considering purchasing. Perfect size for your current needs, great location, much less work to maintain. You don't think I'm giving up too much space? I think you're making a practical decision based on your current lifestyle and future preferences. It's exactly the kind of thoughtful planning I've come to expect from you. The house sale provided another opportunity for Daniel to demonstrate his changed priorities. The proceeds from my family home were substantial, enough to constitute a significant inheritance if I had chosen to leave it to him. Instead, I established one final charitable fund focused on supporting seniors who wanted to age in their own homes, providing services that would allow them to maintain independence and dignity. Daniel's response to this final donation was telling. Rather than expressing disappointment about another lost inheritance opportunity, he praised the thoughtfulness of the program and offered to help with the legal structuring of the foundation. "This is brilliant, Mom," he said as we reviewed the program guidelines. "You've identified a real need and created a sustainable way to address it. The legal framework is sophisticated but accessible, the funding structure is sound, and the service delivery model is both practical and dignified. You sound surprised that I could design something this complex." Daniel laughed, but it was a sound full of genuine affection rather than embarrassment. "I sound impressed that anyone could design something this comprehensive and effective. Your supposedly senile brain has created a program that could serve as a model for similar initiatives nationwide." The word senile no longer carried the sting it once had, perhaps because Daniel now used it ironically to highlight how wrong his original assessment had been. His newfound respect for my intellectual capabilities felt genuine, based on observed evidence rather than obligatory filial sentiment. As autumn returned, marking a full year since the confrontation that had changed everything between us, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from such a painful beginning. Daniel's accusation of mental incompetence had hurt deeply, but it had also forced me to examine my own assumptions about aging, family, and self-worth. The charitable foundations I had established were thriving, providing assistance to hundreds of people and funding important research and preservation work. The process of creating them had been intellectually stimulating and personally fulfilling, proving to myself as much as to others that my mind remained sharp and my judgment sound. More importantly, the crisis had ultimately strengthened my relationship with Daniel by forcing both of us to confront uncomfortable truths and choose more authentic ways of relating to each other. He had learned to see me as a complete person rather than simply his aging mother. I had learned to value my own independence and capabilities rather than defining myself primarily through my relationship with him. The cottage I had purchased was perfect for this new phase of my life, with space for a small workshop where I could continue doing restoration projects that interested me, a garden large enough for my needs but not so large as to be overwhelming, and proximity to the community resources and social activities that were becoming increasingly important as I aged. Daniel visited regularly, but our time together felt balanced rather than obligatory. He contributed to my life through his company and assistance, while I contributed to his through advice, support, and the kind of unconditional love that had never actually been dependent on financial inheritance. One evening in early October, as we sat in my new living room enjoying the warmth of the fireplace and talking about his latest legal cases, Daniel brought up a subject we hadn't discussed in months. "Do you ever regret giving away the inheritance?" he asked. "Not because of my reaction, but because of other opportunities you might have had for the money." I considered the question seriously, thinking about the millions of dollars that had found their way to scholarships, research, preservation projects, and senior services rather than to Daniel's bank account. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it at all. The money is doing more good where it is than it ever would have done sitting in investment accounts or funding someone else's lifestyle." "Even if that someone was your son?" "Especially because that someone was my son," I replied. "You've become a much better person without the expectation of inherited wealth hanging over our relationship. You're working in a job you find meaningful, you're rebuilding your life based on your own values, rather than someone else's expectations, and you're treating me like an autonomous adult rather than a source of future financial security." Daniel was quiet for a moment, perhaps contemplating the person he had been versus the person he was becoming. It's strange how losing something I never actually had could end up feeling like gaining so much. "What have you gained?" "I've gained a real relationship with my mother instead of a transactional one. I've gained work that feels meaningful instead of just lucrative. I've gained self-respect based on my own choices, rather than my expectations about other people's money." Those seem like valuable gains. They are. Much more valuable than any inheritance could have been. I smiled, watching the firelight play across his face and thinking about how much we had both changed since that terrible October afternoon, when he had declared me too senile to handle money. He had been wrong about my mental capabilities, but in a strange way, his accusation had launched a journey of self-discovery and family reconciliation that neither of us could have anticipated. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. "Not for the money you might have inherited, but for the man you've chosen to become." Daniel reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. For proving that being 72 doesn't mean being senile. For showing me what real strength and intelligence look like. For giving me another chance to be the son you deserve." Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Inside, we sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way back to each other through honesty, forgiveness, and the recognition that true family bonds are built on love and respect rather than financial expectation. The $6 million I had donated to charity was making a difference in hundreds of lives, funding scholarships for deserving students, supporting medical research, preserving cultural artifacts, and helping seniors maintain their independence. But perhaps the most valuable outcome of my supposedly senile financial decisions was the restoration of a relationship I had feared was lost forever. Daniel had been wrong about my mental capabilities, but his mistake had ultimately led us both to discoveries that were worth far more than any inheritance could ever have been. 2 years had passed since Daniel and I began rebuilding our relationship, and I was spending a crisp November morning reviewing applications for the latest round of scholarship awards when my phone rang with a call that would once again test everything we had worked to reconstruct. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the kind of careful neutrality that usually preceded difficult news. "This is Patricia Wong from Children's Protective Services. I'm calling regarding your son Daniel Mitchell and his daughter Emma." My heart stopped. Daniel's daughter? As far as I knew, Daniel had no children. He and Jennifer had divorced 2 years ago without ever starting a family, and in all our conversations since then, he had never mentioned becoming a father. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I think there may be some mistake. My son doesn't have any children." "Ma'am, we have Daniel Mitchell, age 44, listed as the father of Emma Mitchell, age 6. He's provided your name and contact information as his emergency contact and potential placement option for the child." The room seemed to tilt around me as I tried to process this information. Daniel had a 6-year-old daughter I had never heard of, and apparently Child Protective Services was considering placing her with me. "What happened to Emma's mother?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Sarah Mitchell was killed in a car accident 3 days ago. Mr. Mitchell is currently hospitalized with serious injuries from the same accident, and we need to arrange temporary care for Emma until he's able to resume custody." Sarah. Daniel had mentioned dating someone named Sarah briefly about a year ago, but he had never indicated the relationship was serious enough to involve children, let alone marriage. The fact that the child shared our family name suggested a level of commitment I hadn't known existed. Is Daniel expected to recover? I asked, my mind reeling with questions I wasn't sure how to ask. His doctors are optimistic, but he'll be hospitalized for at least another week and will need several months of physical therapy afterward. He's asked specifically that we contact you about caring for Emma during his recovery. I looked around my small cottage, trying to imagine a 6-year-old child in the carefully ordered space I had created for my quiet retirement years. The restoration workshop would need to be completely child-proofed. The spare bedroom would need to be transformed into something suitable for a grieving little girl. My entire routine would need to be reorganized around the needs of someone who had just lost her mother, and might lose her father too, if his injuries were as serious as they sounded. Can I see Daniel first? I asked. Before I make any decisions about Emma's care? Of course. He's at Regional Medical Center, room 314. Would you be available to meet with us there this afternoon? I'll be there at 2 o'clock. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen chair, staring at the scholarship applications spread across the table and trying to understand how my life had just changed so dramatically in the space of a 5-minute phone call. Daniel had a daughter. He had been married to someone named Sarah, apparently seriously enough that the child bore his name. Sarah was dead, Daniel was hospitalized, and a 6-year-old girl I had never met might be coming to live with me. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of questions and anxieties. Why hadn't Daniel told me about Emma? Had he been deliberately hiding his family from me, or had our reconciliation been too fragile to risk involving a child? What kind of grandmother would I be to a little girl who didn't even know I existed? At 74, was I even capable of caring for an active 6-year-old, especially one dealing with trauma and loss? Regional Medical Center felt familiar from my previous visit when Daniel had his accident 2 years earlier, but this time the circumstances were far more serious. I found room 314 and knocked softly before entering. Daniel lay in the hospital bed, looking pale and battered, his left arm in a cast, his face marked with healing cuts and bruises. But his eyes were alert and filled with a mixture of grief and desperate hope when he saw me enter. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for coming." "Of course I came," I replied, settling into the chair beside his bed, "though I have to admit I'm confused about a few things." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a difficult conversation. "I know you must have questions. Let's start with the obvious one. You have a daughter I've never heard of?" "Emma is the most amazing little girl you could ever imagine," Daniel said, his face lighting up despite his injuries. "She's smart, funny, curious about everything, kind to everyone she meets. She loves books and puzzles and building things with her hands, just like Grandpa Robert used to do." "And Sarah?" Daniel's expression crumbled with fresh grief. "Sarah was wonderful. Patient, loving, the kind of mother who made everything look effortless, but put tremendous thought into everything she did for Emma. We met through my legal work, actually. I was helping her with custody issues from her first marriage." "First marriage?" "Emma's biological father signed away his parental rights when she was 2. He wanted nothing to do with being a parent, left Sarah to raise Emma alone while he started a new family. When Sarah and I got married last year, I adopted Emma legally. She's been calling me Daddy for over a year now. I absorbed this information, understanding now why the child's last name was Mitchell, and why Daniel felt such responsibility for her care. But it still didn't explain why I had been kept in the dark about such significant developments in his life." "Why didn't you tell me about them?" I asked gently. "I would have loved to meet Sarah and Emma." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. "I wanted to. God, Mom, I wanted so badly to tell you about them. But I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that you wouldn't trust my judgment about relationships after the disaster with Jennifer. Afraid that you'd think I was rushing into another marriage too quickly. Afraid that you'd question whether I was ready to be a father, given how badly I had handled being a son." The admission broke my heart. Here was my son, afraid to share his greatest joy with me because our relationship had been so damaged by his previous behavior and my response to it. The reconciliation we had worked so hard to build had apparently still felt too fragile to risk involving other people, especially people as precious to him as a new wife and daughter. "Daniel," I said softly, "I would never have questioned your right to build a family. I might have had concerns about timing or circumstances, but I would have supported any choice that made you happy." "I know that now," he replied. But at the time, I was still learning to trust that our relationship was really solid again. I kept meaning to tell you, kept planning to bring them for a visit, but I wanted to be absolutely sure that we were strong enough to handle any complications that might arise. And now Sarah is gone, and Emma needs someone to take care of her. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "She's so scared, Mom. She doesn't understand why Mommy isn't coming back, why Daddy is in the hospital, why everything in her world has changed overnight. The social worker says she needs stability, familiarity, someone who can help her process what's happened while I recover." "Tell me about Emma," I said. "What does she like? What comforts her? What do I need to know about caring for her?" Daniel's face brightened, despite his obvious pain. "She loves stories, especially fairy tales where good triumphs over evil. She has this stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts that goes everywhere with her, and she needs him to sleep. She's fascinated by how things work, always taking apart toys and putting them back together. She asks a million questions about everything she sees. She sounds like she takes after her grandfather Robert, and her grandmother Eleanor," Daniel added with a weak smile. "She's got your curiosity and your determination. When she decides she wants to understand something, she doesn't give up until she figures it out." A social worker entered the room at that moment, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the sort of competent demeanor that suggested extensive experience with family crises. She introduced herself as Patricia Wong, the woman I had spoken with on the phone. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, settling into a chair across from Daniel's bed. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I know this is a lot to process, but we need to make arrangements for Emma's care as soon as possible. What exactly would be required?" I asked. "In terms of legal responsibility, duration of care, support services?" "Initially, we're looking at temporary guardianship while Daniel recovers from his injuries," Patricia explained. "Probably 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer depending on his rehabilitation progress. You would have full responsibility for Emma's daily care, including getting her to school, managing her medical needs, helping her process her grief. What about counseling? She must be traumatized by losing her mother. We've arranged for her to see a child psychologist who specializes in trauma and loss. Dr. Amanda Chen has excellent credentials and experience helping children Emma's age cope with sudden family changes." I noticed that the psychologist shared a surname with Dr. Sarah Chen, who had evaluated my mental competence 2 years earlier. Perhaps it was a family practice that specialized in different aspects of psychological assessment and treatment. Emma would need her own room, appropriate supervision, and someone who can provide emotional support during a very difficult time. Patricia continued. "Given your age, Mrs. Mitchell, we would want to ensure you have resources available if you need assistance with her care." The tactful reference to my age brought back uncomfortable memories of being questioned about my capabilities, though in this context, the concern seemed legitimate rather than condescending. Caring for a traumatized 6-year-old would be challenging for someone of any age, but particularly for a woman in her 70s who had never raised children beyond her own son. "What kind of assistance might be available?" I asked. "We can arrange for respite care if you need breaks, home health services if you require help with daily tasks, and emergency support if any issues arise that you feel unable to handle independently." Daniel spoke up from his hospital bed. "Mom, I know this is a huge ask. I know it's not fair to drop this responsibility on you without warning. But Emma needs family right now, and you're the only family she has besides me." I looked at my son, bruised and broken but desperate to ensure his daughter's well-being, and thought about the 6-year-old girl who was probably sitting in some sterile office right now, clutching a stuffed elephant and wondering why her world had collapsed overnight. The practical concerns were significant. My cottage was small, my routine was settled, my energy was not what it had been at 40 or 50. But the child was family, and family took care of each other, especially in times of crisis. "Can I meet Emma before I make a final decision?" I asked. "I think we should see how we get along before committing to several weeks of living together." "Of course," Patricia agreed. She's currently staying at a temporary foster home, but we could arrange for you to visit with her this afternoon. Actually, Daniel interjected, I'd like to be there when you meet her, if the hospital will allow it. She needs to know that I approve of this arrangement, that I'm not abandoning her to strangers. Patricia made some phone calls and arranged for Emma to visit the hospital that afternoon, accompanied by her temporary foster mother. Daniel would be able to introduce us properly and explain the situation to Emma in age-appropriate terms. I spent the interim hours driving home to prepare my cottage for the possibility of a young houseguest. The spare bedroom needed immediate attention, transformed from a storage area for old furniture into something resembling a child's room. I moved boxes to the basement, dusted surfaces that hadn't been cleaned in months, and tried to imagine what a 6-year-old would need to feel comfortable in an unfamiliar space. The local toy store provided emergency supplies, coloring books and crayons, a few puzzles appropriate for Emma's age, some children's books with beautiful illustrations. I realized I had no idea what 6-year-olds actually played with these days, having been removed from that world for decades, but the store clerk was helpful in suggesting items that might provide comfort and distraction for a grieving child. By the time I returned to the hospital at 4 o'clock, I felt as prepared as possible for what was essentially an audition for temporary grandmother. The stakes felt enormous. If Emma and I couldn't connect, if she found me too old or too strange or too different from what she was used to, the social services department would need to find alternative arrangements that might separate her even further from the few familiar elements left in her disrupted life. Patricia was waiting in the hospital lobby with a woman I assumed was the foster mother and a small figure who had to be Emma. The little girl was exactly as Daniel had described. Curious, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that looked slightly crooked as if she had tried to fix it herself, and a worn stuffed elephant clutched tightly in her arms. She looked so small standing in that institutional lobby, surrounded by adults making decisions about her future. When she saw me approaching, she pressed closer to her foster mother, clearly uncertain about who I was or what my presence might mean for her already chaotic world. "Emma," Patricia said gently, "this is Mrs. Mitchell. She's your daddy's mommy, which makes her your grandmother." Emma looked up at me with solemn eyes that seemed far too serious for someone so young. "Daddy said his mommy was very smart and fixed old things to make them beautiful again." "That's right," I said, kneeling down so we could talk at eye level. "I take old furniture and help it become strong and pretty again. Your daddy told me that you like to build things too." Emma nodded shyly. "I like Legos and puzzles, and I helped Mommy fix the lamp in my bedroom when it stopped working." The past tense reference to her mother was delivered matter-of-factly, but I could see the confusion and pain lurking behind her composed exterior. This little girl was trying so hard to be brave, to handle circumstances that would challenge adults, let alone children. "Would you like to go see Daddy now?" I asked. "He's been waiting for you." Emma's face brightened for the first time since I'd arrived. "Is he feeling better? The doctors said he was hurt, but that he would be okay." "He's getting better every day," I assured her. "But he needs to stay in the hospital a little longer so the doctors can make sure he heals properly." We rode the elevator to Daniel's floor, Emma holding my hand with surprising trust for someone who had just met me. Her small fingers felt warm and slightly sticky, and I found myself remembering Daniel at that age, always reaching for my hand when he was nervous or uncertain. Daniel's face lit up when Emma entered his room, and she ran to his bedside with the kind of unrestrained joy that only children can express. "Daddy, I missed you so much. Are you still hurt?" "I'm much better now that you're here," Daniel said, carefully hugging her with his uninjured arm. "Emma, I want you to meet someone very special. This is my mom, your Grandma Eleanor." Emma turned to look at me with renewed interest. "You're really Daddy's mom?" "I really am. And I've been waiting my whole life to meet you." "Daddy says you live in a house with a workshop where you fix old things. Do you have tools like Grandpa Robert used to have?" I glanced at Daniel in surprise. "You told her about Robert?" "I've told her lots of stories about both her grandfathers," Daniel replied. She knows that Grandpa Robert was a craftsman who loved working with his hands, and that he would have adored having a granddaughter who likes to build things. Emma climbed carefully onto the bed beside Daniel, being mindful of his injuries. "Can I see your workshop, Grandma Eleanor? If your daddy thinks it's okay, I'd love to show you the workshop. We could even work on a project together if you'd like." "Really? Could we fix something together?" Daniel caught my eye over Emma's head, and I could see the hope and gratitude in his expression. This little girl was already connecting with me, already showing interest in the activities that had defined so much of my life with Robert. Perhaps the transition wouldn't be as difficult as I had feared. We spent an hour in Daniel's hospital room, with Emma chattering about her temporary foster home, her worries about starting a new school, and her questions about when her daddy would be able to come home. Daniel explained that I had invited her to stay at my house while he recovered, that she would have her own room and could help me with projects in the workshop. "Will Mr. Peanuts like it there?" Emma asked, holding up her stuffed elephant. "I think Mr. Peanuts will love it," I said seriously. "He can help us with our projects. Elephants are very good at remembering where we put our tools." Emma giggled, the first completely carefree sound I had heard from her. "Mr. Peanuts doesn't really remember things. He's just stuffed." "Are you sure about that?" I asked conspiratorially. "Sometimes stuffed animals remember more than we think they do." By the time we left the hospital, Emma seemed genuinely excited about staying with me. The social worker completed the necessary paperwork, while Emma and I discussed what she would need from her temporary foster home and what special things we should buy to make her room at my house feel welcoming. "Can we get glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling?" Emma asked as we walked to the parking lot. "Mommy and I were going to put them up in my room at home, but then the accident happened." The casual reference to her mother's death was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Emma clearly didn't fully understand the permanence of what had occurred, but she was trying to navigate her new reality with remarkable resilience. "We can definitely get glow-in-the-dark stars," I promised. "We can put them up together and you can show me the patterns your mommy taught you." The transition to my cottage went more smoothly than anyone had predicted. Emma approved of the room I had prepared for her, helped me arrange her few belongings in the dresser and closet, and carefully positioned Mr. Peanuts on the bed where he could watch over everything. "This is a nice house," she announced after we had completed the tour. "It smells like the furniture polish Mommy used, and there are lots of books." I showed her the workshop, carefully explaining which tools were safe for her to touch and which ones she needed to ask permission to use. Her eyes widened at the array of sanding equipment, brushes, stains, and half-completed projects. "Could I really help you fix something?" she asked wonderingly. "Absolutely. In fact, I have a perfect project for us to work on together." I led her to a corner where I had been storing a small wooden rocking chair that had belonged to Robert's grandmother. The chair was fundamentally sound but needed refinishing, and the project would be perfect for teaching a 6-year-old basic restoration techniques while creating something she could keep as a memento of our time together. "This chair is almost 100 years old," I explained. "It belonged to your great-great-grandmother, and I think she would have loved knowing that you were helping to make it beautiful again." Emma approached the chair with reverence, running her small hands over the worn wood. "It's really old, isn't it? But still strong. Very old and very strong. Just like some people I know." That evening, as I helped Emma get ready for bed in her new room, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Grandma Eleanor, when is Mommy coming home?" I sat on the edge of her bed, choosing my words carefully. Daniel and I had discussed how to handle this conversation, but no amount of preparation could make it easy. "Emma, sweetie, you remember that Mommy was hurt very badly in the car accident, don't you?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Daddy said the doctors tried to fix her, but she was hurt too much." "That's right. When someone is hurt that badly, they can't come home again. They have to go to a special place called heaven, where they're not hurt anymore." "So Mommy is in heaven now?" "Yes, honey. Mommy is in heaven, and she's not hurt anymore, and she can watch over you and make sure you're safe and loved." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious concentration that seemed to characterize her approach to difficult concepts. "Will Daddy go to heaven too?" she asked finally. "No, sweetheart. Daddy is going to get all better and come home to you. The doctors are taking very good care of him, and soon he'll be strong enough to leave the hospital. And I can stay here with you until then? You can stay here with me for as long as you need to." I promised. "We'll take care of each other, and we'll work on our projects, and we'll make sure Mr. Peanuts is comfortable." Emma smiled and hugged her stuffed elephant tighter. "Mr. Peanuts likes it here. He told me so. I'm glad. I like having both of you here." The next few weeks fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Emma attended first grade at the local elementary school, where the teachers had been briefed about her situation and were providing additional support as she adjusted to her new circumstances. I walked her to school each morning and picked her up each afternoon. Activities that added structure and purpose to my days. Afternoons were spent in the workshop, where Emma proved to be a remarkably capable assistant. She had steady hands for someone so young, patience with detailed work, and an intuitive understanding of how different materials responded to various treatments. Working on the rocking chair together gave us shared goals and conversation topics that helped bridge the generational gap between us. "Why do you put the stain on so thin?" Emma asked one afternoon as we worked on refinishing the chair's arms. "Because thin coats soak into the wood better and look more natural when they dry," I explained. "If we put it on too thick, it would look painted instead of stained." "Like makeup?" "Exactly like makeup. We want to enhance the natural beauty of the wood, not cover it up." Emma nodded seriously and continued applying stain with the careful concentration she brought to all her projects. Her progress was remarkable, and I found myself genuinely impressed by her skill and attention to detail. Evenings followed a routine of homework, dinner, and stories before bed. Emma was a voracious reader for her age, and she particularly loved books about children who overcame challenges through courage and cleverness. We read fairy tales, adventure stories, and picture books about family relationships, all of which seemed to help her process her own situation. "I like the story about the girl who lived with her grandmother," Emma said one night after we finished a book about a child whose parents were traveling. "The grandmother knew how to do lots of things and taught the girl to be strong and smart." "What kinds of things did the grandmother teach her?" "How to cook and sew and take care of plants and animals. And how to be brave when scary things happened." "Those are important skills," I agreed. "What would you like me to teach you?" Emma considered this question with characteristic seriousness. "I want to learn how to fix broken things like you do. And I want to learn how to be strong like Mommy was." "Your mommy was very strong," I said gently. "And you're strong too. You've been so brave about everything that's happened." "Sometimes I don't feel brave. Sometimes I feel scared and sad." "That's okay, sweetie. Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared or sad. It means you keep trying to do the right things even when you feel scared or sad." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Like coming to live with you even though I didn't know you before?" "Exactly like that. You were brave enough to trust me and give us a chance to become a family." "Are we a family now?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. In just a few weeks, this little girl had become central to my daily routine, my emotional well-being, and my sense of purpose. I cared about her happiness, worried about her adjustment, felt proud of her accomplishments, and was already dreading the day when Daniel recovered enough to take her home. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "We're definitely a family now." Emma smiled and snuggled deeper under her covers. "Good. I like being your family." The weeks passed more quickly than I had expected, filled with school activities, workshop projects, visits to Daniel in the hospital, and the countless small domestic tasks that come with caring for a 6-year-old. Emma thrived under the consistent routine and individual attention, her natural curiosity and intelligence blossoming in an environment where her questions were encouraged and her interests were supported. The rocking chair project became a symbol of her resilience and growth. By the time we finished refinishing it, She had mastered basic sanding techniques, learned to apply stain evenly, and developed an appreciation for the patience required to do quality work. More importantly, she had created something beautiful with her own hands, something that would always remind her of her strength and capability. "It looks brand new," she announced with satisfaction when we completed the final coat of protective finish. "But you can still tell it's old because of the special marks in the wood." "Those special marks are called patina," I explained. "They show the history of the piece, all the people who used it before us." "Like Daddy's great-great-grandmother?" "Exactly. And someday, when you're grown up, you'll be able to tell your children about the time you helped restore this chair when you were 6 years old." Emma climbed into the chair and rocked gently, testing the smooth motion and admiring the lustrous finish we had achieved together. "I want to remember everything about staying with you, Grandma Eleanor, even when Daddy gets better and we go home." The reference to going home brought up feelings I hadn't expected. Over the past month, Emma had become such an integral part of my life that I couldn't imagine my cottage without her presence. The scholarship applications I reviewed seemed less important than helping with first-grade homework. The quiet evenings I had once treasured now felt empty compared to bedtime stories and conversations about 6-year-old concerns. "You'll always be welcome here," I said carefully. "Even after Daddy is better, this will always be your second home. Could I come visit sometimes? And work on projects in the workshop?" "I would love that more than anything." Daniel's recovery progressed steadily, and by early December, he was ready to be discharged from the hospital. His physical therapy would continue for several more months, but he could manage basic daily activities and resume limited parental responsibilities. The social worker scheduled a meeting to discuss transitioning Emma back to Daniel's care and closing the temporary guardianship arrangement. I approached that meeting with mixed emotions. I was genuinely happy that Daniel had recovered well enough to care for his daughter again, proud of how Emma had adjusted to the traumatic changes in her life, and satisfied that I had been able to provide the stability and support she needed during the crisis. But I was also facing the reality that my daily routine would return to its previous quiet predictability, that the cottage would feel empty without Emma's chatter and laughter, and that my role in her life would necessarily become more peripheral. "Emma has thrived in your care," Patricia Wong observed as we reviewed the case file. "Her teachers report significant improvement in her mood and academic performance, and she's clearly bonded strongly with you." "She's a remarkable child," I replied. "Resilient, intelligent, and surprisingly mature for her age." "Daniel, how do you feel about the transition back to single parenting?" My son looked healthier than he had in months, though he still moved carefully and tired more easily than before his injuries. "I'm grateful beyond words for everything Mom has done for Emma and for me. I know this hasn't been easy for her, taking on the care of a grieving 6-year-old at her age." The phrase "at her age" stung slightly, echoing older concerns about my capabilities, but I recognized that Daniel's comment wasn't meant as criticism. Caring for Emma had been physically demanding in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, and there had been moments when I questioned whether I had the energy and stamina required for full-time parenting at 74. "What are your plans for ongoing childcare?" Patricia asked. "You'll be continuing physical therapy for several more months, and you'll need reliable support for Emma's care. I've arranged for a part-time nanny to help with transportation and supervision when my therapy schedule conflicts with Emma's school hours," Daniel explained. "And I'm hoping Mom will continue to be involved as much as she's willing to be." Emma, who had been quietly coloring at a small table in the corner of the office, looked up with interest. "Can I still come to Grandma Eleanor's house? And work in the workshop?" "Of course you can," I said immediately. "We have several projects we haven't finished yet." "And you could come to our apartment too," Emma suggested. "Daddy's making the extra room into my new bedroom, and I want to show you how we're decorating it." Daniel smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. "You're welcome anytime, Mom. In fact, I was hoping you might consider having dinner with us a few times a week. Emma's been telling me about all the cooking skills you've been teaching her." The prospect of remaining closely involved in Emma's life made the transition feel less like losing something precious and more like gaining an extended family relationship. Over the past month, I had discovered that being a grandmother was profoundly different from being a mother, offering many of the joys of child rearing without the overwhelming responsibility that had characterized raising Daniel as a single parent. "I'd love to continue spending time with Emma," I said. "And with you too, Daniel. You've both become central to my life in ways I hadn't expected." The formal guardianship arrangement concluded with paperwork and handshakes, but the emotional bonds that had been formed would clearly continue long after the legal obligations ended. Emma packed her belongings from my cottage with the solemnity of someone who understood she was leaving something important behind, though she was also excited about returning to live with her father. "Thank you for taking care of me when I was scared," she said as we loaded her suitcase into Daniel's car. "And for teaching me how to fix old things to make them beautiful again." "Thank you for teaching me how to be a grandmother," I replied, hugging her tightly. "And for reminding me that some of the best things in life happen when we're not expecting them." Daniel embraced me as well, his hug conveying gratitude that went beyond words. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You saved Emma's life, and probably mine too." "You don't need to thank me for loving my granddaughter," I said simply. "That's what families do for each other." The cottage felt remarkably quiet after they left, but it wasn't the oppressive silence I had feared. Instead, it was the peaceful quiet of a space that had served its purpose well, that would always hold memories of an unexpected chapter in my life, when I discovered I had more love and energy to give than I had realized. Emma visited twice that week, helping me organize the workshop and start planning our next restoration project. Daniel came for dinner on Sunday, bringing flowers and a bottle of wine and stories about Emma's adjustment to their new living arrangement. Gradually, we settled into a routine that allowed me to maintain my independence while staying closely connected to their daily lives. The holidays that year were unlike any I had experienced before. Instead of the quiet Christmas mornings that had characterized my recent years, I woke up to Emma's excited chatter as she explored the presents under my tree. Instead of heating simple meals for one, I cooked elaborate dinners for three, with Emma helping measure ingredients and Daniel contributing his surprisingly competent skills at setting elegant tables. "This is the best Christmas ever," Emma announced after we had opened all the gifts and eaten all the special breakfast pastries I had prepared. "Because I have Daddy back, and I have a grandmother now too." "It's pretty wonderful," Daniel agreed, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To unexpected families and second chances. To stubborn old women who turned out not to be too senile to handle money or children," I replied with a smile. Emma looked confused by the reference to senility. But Daniel laughed and raised his cup higher. "To the smartest woman I know, who proved that wisdom and capability aren't diminished by age." As the afternoon sun slanted through my living room windows, casting warm light over the three of us as we cleaned up wrapping paper and planned the day's activities, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years ago, Daniel had accused me of being too mentally diminished to manage my own financial affairs. In response, I had donated millions of dollars to charity, proving not only my mental acuity but also my commitment to using my resources for meaningful purposes. The charitable foundations I had established were thriving, providing scholarships to dozens of students, funding important research, and supporting seniors who wanted to age with dignity in their own homes. The money was making a genuine difference in hundreds of lives, creating lasting benefits that far exceeded anything that could have been achieved by leaving it to Daniel as a traditional inheritance. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome of that financial decision was the way it had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened our family bonds. Daniel's loss of expected inheritance had forced him to examine his values and priorities, leading him to choose more meaningful work and more authentic relationships. My assertion of financial independence had demonstrated my continued competence while freeing both of us from the complications that inherited wealth might have created. Most importantly, the crisis that began with accusations of mental incompetence had led to Emma's presence in our lives. If Daniel and Jennifer had successfully gained control of my finances, they would probably still be married, probably still living in California, probably never would have met Sarah or become parents. Emma might never have existed, or if she had, she would have been part of a completely different family constellation. "Grandma Eleanor," Emma said, interrupting my contemplative mood, When I grow up, I want to fix old things and make them beautiful like you do. That would be wonderful, I replied. But you don't have to wait until you grow up to start. We have lots of projects we can work on together. And when I get really good at it, I can help other people fix their broken things too. Yes, you can. That's what the best craftspeople do. They use their skills to help other people preserve the things that matter to them. Emma nodded seriously, already planning her future career as a restoration specialist. Daniel watched this exchange with the kind of pride that suggested he finally understood what it meant to value family relationships for their own sake, rather than for their financial implications. The year that followed was perhaps the richest of my life. Emma visited regularly, developing genuine expertise in basic restoration techniques, and showing the kind of natural aptitude that reminded me of Robert's intuitive understanding of materials and craftsmanship. Daniel and I maintained our weekly dinners, our relationship now based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than financial obligation. The charitable foundations continued to flourish, transforming lives through education and preservation work. On Emma's 7th birthday, as we celebrated in my workshop surrounded by the projects we had completed together, I realized that being called too senile to handle money had led to the most fulfilling chapter of my life. Sometimes the cruelest accusations reveal the most beautiful truths about what really matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.